In the frozen wilderness of Eastern Europe, where mountains pierce the sky like jagged teeth and forests stretch endlessly into darkness, something extraordinary was about to unfold. A story so extraordinary, so seemingly impossible, that wildlife experts would later struggle to believe it had actually happened. But the evidence was there, the scars, the DNA, the photographs, all of it documented and verified by research teams who had dedicated years to understanding one of nature's most incredible tales of survival, determination, and love. His name was Leonidas. At least that's what the rangers called him when they first tracked him through the remote valleys of the Carpathian Mountains. A massive lion, weighing over 480 pounds, with a mane so dark it seemed to absorb the mountain sunlight. But Leonidas was supposed to be dead. He was supposed to have perished 3 years earlier when a landslide had separated him from his pride during the brutal winter of 2019. The circumstances of his disappearance had been documented. The search efforts had been extensive. The conclusion had been inevitable. A lion, alone in sub-zero temperatures, cut off from his family, separated by impassable terrain. Survival seemed impossible. Yet here he was, 3 years later, moving through the snow-covered forests of Romania with absolute purpose. His enormous paws left prints nearly the size of human hands in the deep snow. His breath came in white plumes that dissipated into the freezing air. And his destination was fixed, unwavering. He was heading toward the last known location of his pride, toward home, toward family. But what he didn't know, what none of the researchers monitoring this journey could have predicted, was that standing between him and everything he loved were approximately 100 grey wolves, not scattered across the landscape, but organized, coordinated, hungry, and absolutely determined to claim this intruder as their prey. The story begins not with Leonidas, but with what happened before he disappeared, with a pride of lions that had existed in this region for nearly a decade, defying the odds, surviving in conditions that most lions simply could not endure. The pride consisted of 8 individuals when everything changed. 3 adult males, 4 lionesses, and 1 young juvenile male who was just beginning to develop his man. They lived in a valley protected on 3 sides by steep mountains, with a single passage that led to the lower elevations where prey was more abundant. It was a precarious existence, constantly on the edge of survival, but it was theirs. Leonidas had been the pride's dominant male for 4 years. He had fathered more than 12 cubs over that time, his genetics spreading through the small population. He was not just a king among his own pride. He had become a symbol to the research teams studying this remote population, proof that lions could adapt to climates far harsher than their African homeland, proof that these magnificent creatures could survive in territories where the very landscape seemed determined to kill them. The documentary crews who had filmed the pride referred to him as the warrior king, and for good reason. Leonidas bore scars from countless battles, a missing portion of his right ear from a fight with a rival male, deep gouges across his shoulders from conflicts with bears, a twisted scar running the length of his left flank that spoke of a wound so severe most lions would have died from it. But in the winter of 2019, everything changed in a single afternoon. The weather had been unusually harsh that year. Snow had fallen earlier than normal and deeper than anyone could remember. The pride had adapted as they always did, hunting less frequently, conserving energy, relying on stored fat to sustain them through the long frozen months. On February 14, 2019, Leonidas and 2 of his lionesses had ventured down from their valley in search of a deer herd that had been reported moving through the lower elevations. It was a calculated risk. The journey down the mountain passage would take them through narrow canyons where an avalanche was always possible, but hunger had driven them to take that risk. The avalanche came without warning. One moment the 3 lions were carefully picking their way down the snow-covered slope. The next moment, the entire mountainside seemed to be moving. The roar of millions of tons of snow, ice, and rock was louder than thunder. It was like the earth itself was tearing apart. The 2 lionesses managed to jump to higher ground, clinging to a rocky outcrop as the avalanche swept past them. But Leonidas, positioned slightly ahead, had nowhere to go. The wall of snow and debris caught him, lifted him, tumbled him through the air like a toy. He was carried nearly half a mile down the mountainside before finally coming to rest, buried under 6 feet of snow and rubble. The lionesses watched helplessly as their mate disappeared into the chaos. They called out with roars that were swallowed by the sound of the continuing avalanche. When silence finally returned to the mountains, Leonidas was gone. The two females descended carefully once the danger had passed, but they found no sign of him, no body, no blood, no indication that he had survived. After an hour of searching through the disturbed snow, their roars of grief echoing across the frozen landscape, they turned and made their way back up the mountain to the Pride. They were returning home, but they were returning without their king. The research team that had been monitoring the Pride from a remote outpost at the base of the mountains documented the lioness's return that evening. The footage showed them arriving agitated and distressed, making vocalizations that indicated severe trauma. Within hours, every member of the Pride knew that something had happened. Leonidas was gone. The weeks that followed were difficult for the Pride. The other two males attempted to assume leadership, but neither had Leonidas's experience or strength. The hunt became less successful. The Pride grew hungry. Cubs that Leonidas had fathered began to grow weak from insufficient nutrition. The research team launched a search effort that lasted 3 weeks. They used drones equipped with thermal imaging to scan the avalanche path. They searched caves and crevices where a lion might have taken shelter. They found nothing. Absolutely nothing. The conclusion seemed inevitable. Leonidas had been killed by the avalanche. His body had either been carried further down the mountain by subsequent slides, buried too deeply to find, or had already been scavenged by wolves or bears. The wildlife documentary that had been following the Pride was hastily edited to provide closure to the story. Leonidas was memorialized. His death was treated as a tragic but natural conclusion to the tale of a lion who had tried to survive in an impossible environment. But Leonidas wasn't dead. What the search team didn't know was that he had been swept even farther down the mountain than they had searched. He had tumbled into a narrow crevasse that had then been covered by additional snow, essentially creating an ice cave that had hidden him from thermal imaging and visual inspection. When he finally regained consciousness, his body battered and broken, his left leg twisted in a way that suggested a fracture, he found himself in near total darkness, temperatures dropping far below zero, with no obvious way out. Most lions would have died there. In fact, most lions would have died within hours. But Leonidas was different. The research teams would later use the word indomitable when describing his will to survive. For 2 days he remained in that crevasse, his twisted leg preventing him from climbing, his injuries too severe for him to move more than a few feet. On the 3rd day, using rocks as leverage, pushing with his powerful front legs, he managed to create an opening in the ice above him. He dragged himself out into the freezing night, bleeding from multiple wounds, his leg bent at an angle that should have rendered him completely immobile. What happened over the next 3 years could fill volumes. How he survived the initial recovery period with injuries that would have killed any normal animal. How he learned to move again despite a leg that would never fully heal. How he hunted in a landscape where prey was scarce and winters were long. How he avoided bears, wolves, and the occasional hunter who ventured into these remote mountains. The research teams would eventually piece together his survival story through tracking data, scat analysis, and remote camera footage. They documented a lion learning to adapt to an environment that seemed determined to destroy him. They documented a will to live that transcended biology and defied everything scientists thought they understood about the limits of animal endurance. But all of this was secondary to the driving force that had kept Leonidas moving for 3 years. A single, unwavering purpose that had sustained him through pain, hunger, and isolation. His family. Leonidas had not forgotten them. He could not forget them. Their scents were burned into his memory. The vocalizations of his cubs echoed in his mind, even in the depths of winter when sound seemed to freeze in the air. He had a family waiting for him, somewhere on the other side of the mountains, and every day that passed increased the urgency of his need to return to them. In the winter of 2022, exactly 3 years after his disappearance, Leonidas began his journey home. His leg, though permanently damaged, had developed scar tissue that provided just enough stability to allow him to travel long distances. His coat had grown thick to protect against the cold. His hunting skills had evolved to match the environment. He was no longer the king of his pride. He was something else, a ghost, a legend, a creature that the mountains themselves seemed to have created. If you love extraordinary true stories of animal survival and determination that will leave you absolutely speechless, you need to subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell, because what happens next in Leonidas's journey will challenge everything you thought possible in the animal kingdom. He began moving toward the region where the pride had last been documented, the valley, the mountain passage, the territory that had been his home. But the mountains had changed in 3 years. The climate patterns had shifted, the prey distribution had altered, and most importantly, the wolf packs had become far more aggressive and coordinated. Leonidas didn't understand what was happening until he was nearly into their territory. The first warning signs came in the form of distant howls, echoing across the frozen landscape, howls that were answered by other howls, creating a chorus that grew louder and more ominous with each passing hour. The grey wolf packs of Eastern Europe are unlike anything found in most of the world. These are not the relatively small packs of North America. These are massive organizational structures, sometimes numbering over 100 individuals, coordinated with a level of sophistication that rivals primate societies. They hunt in formations. They employ strategy. They communicate through a complex system of vocalizations that conveys specific information about prey location, predator danger, and pack movements. And they had absolutely never encountered a lion before. When the first scouts came into visual range, they stopped dead in their tracks. These were massive wolves, weighing 80 to 100 pounds each, animals that normally dominated every other predator in their environment. But this creature was something else entirely. It moved on 4 legs but rose to nearly 7 feet when it stretched. Its mane, thick and dark, made it appear even larger, and its eyes held an intelligence and awareness that spoke of absolute confidence. The wolves reported back to their pack leaders through a series of howls and body language signals. What happened next would be observed in fragments by the research team, pieced together from camera trap footage, drone recordings, and tracking data. The 100 wolves were gathering. This wasn't a casual response to an intruder. This was a coordinated mobilization of defensive forces. The pack had decided that this creature was either a threat that needed to be eliminated or an opportunity for an unprecedented hunt that would provide meat for the entire pack through the winter months. Either way, they intended to prevent him from traveling any further into their territory. Leonidas's first encounter with the wolf pack came at dusk on a day in early December. He had been making steady progress through the mountains for 2 weeks, moving at a pace that his injured leg could sustain. He had successfully hunted a young moose and fed for 3 days on the meat. He was moving through a narrow pass between 2 mountains, terrain that offered some protection from the cold, when the wolves emerged from the surrounding trees. Not all 100, that would come later, but the initial contingent numbered at least 40. They didn't attack immediately. They formed a semicircle in front of him, blocking his path, their body language making it clear that this was a challenge, an assertion of territorial dominance, a demand that he turn around and leave immediately. Leonidas stopped moving. He surveyed the situation with the careful calculation of an animal that had survived every predatory encounter nature could throw at him. His assessment was simple. These wolves were organized, coordinated, and numerous, but they were also uncertain. They had never faced a lion before. They didn't know what he was capable of. They didn't know what a direct charge from an animal weighing nearly 500 pounds felt like. And Leonidas intended to make sure they found out. What happened next was captured partially on a camera trap mounted by the research team and witnessed by a forest ranger who was monitoring the region from a distance. Leonidas roared. It wasn't a warning roar or a territorial call. It was an announcement of pure power. The sound carried for miles across the mountains, echoing off the peaks, resonating through the valleys. It was a roar that said, "I am here, I am not leaving, and I will do whatever is necessary to reach my destination." The wolves flinched. For just a moment their coordination wavered. Leonidas used that moment to charge directly toward the center of their formation. 40 wolves versus 1 lion should have been an absolute slaughter. But Leonidas didn't fight like a normal lion. He fought like an animal that had been forged by 3 years of brutal survival. His movements were economical but devastating. He targeted the largest wolves first, bulls that he perceived as leaders. His massive paws, each equipped with claws nearly 2 inches long, raked across hides and opened wounds that bled profusely in the cold air. The wolves responded with the coordinated aggression they had developed over thousands of years of pack hunting. They attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, trying to surround him, trying to bring him down through sheer weight and numbers. But Leonidas was faster than any of them had anticipated. Despite his injured leg, he was capable of lightning-quick movements. He twisted away from attacks. He pivoted to face new threats. He used his massive shoulder muscles to deflect charging wolves. In the chaos of combat, the camera trap captured a moment that would later be analyzed frame by wildlife experts around the world. Leonidas, surrounded by wolves, his mane soaked with blood, his mouth open in a snarl, his body coiled with lethal tension, looking absolutely invincible. The battle lasted approximately 40 minutes. When it finally ended, at least 15 wolves lay dead or dying on the snow-covered ground. Another 20 had sustained serious injuries. The remaining wolves withdrew, regrouped, and maintained their distance. Leonidas stood breathing heavily, blood covering his face and mane, new wounds evident across his shoulders and flanks, but he was still standing, he was still mobile, and he was still moving toward his objective. He had won the first battle, but this war was far from over. The pack would return. They always did. The wolves didn't attack again that first night. Instead, they maintained their distance, tracking Leonidas from the shadows, howling to communicate with other packs in the region. The research team monitoring the situation from their outpost realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, a coordinated response from multiple wolf packs to a single intruder. Messages were being sent across the mountains through vocalizations that carried for miles. The alpha leaders were strategizing. They were sharing information about this new threat. They were preparing for a coordinated assault on a scale that had probably never been attempted in the history of wolf predation. Leonidas moved through the night, despite his exhaustion and new injuries. He understood something primal that transcended the merely intellectual. He understood that allowing the wolves to rest, to fully organize, to coordinate their forces, would only make his situation more dire. Every mile he traveled closer to his family was a mile gained toward safety. He couldn't afford to rest. He couldn't afford to wait. The pain in his injured leg was now compounded by fresh wounds across his shoulders and one particularly deep gash along his left flank, where a wolf's fangs had penetrated nearly 2 inches into his muscle tissue. By the second night after the initial encounter, the wolves had begun their next phase of strategy. The pack leaders had decided that a direct frontal assault hadn't worked because it allowed Leonidas to use his raw power against individual wolves. They needed a different approach. They needed to exhaust him. They needed to wear him down through sustained pressure, constant harassment, denying him rest and the opportunity to feed. This was a strategy that had worked against weaker prey. It was a strategy that might work against a single lion who was already wounded and moving through an environment where the wolves held every geographical advantage. The harassment began at sunset on the second day. Small groups of wolves, never more than 5 or 6 at a time, would attack from different directions, striking at his flanks, attempting to drive him towards steeper terrain where his injured leg would be more of a liability. The moment he turned to face them, they would retreat, their movements coordinated with almost military precision. This continued through the night. Attack, retreat, regroup, attack again. Leonidas killed 3 more wolves during these harassment runs, but the cost to his own body was mounting with each engagement. The research team, watching through thermal imaging from their remote monitoring station, documented his movements throughout the night. They could see his heat signature slowing. They could see him limping more heavily after each confrontation. They could see the mathematical reality of his situation becoming clearer with each passing hour. 1 animal versus 100. Even an animal as magnificent and resilient as Leonidas couldn't maintain this level of combat indefinitely. The wolves seemed to understand this. They weren't panicking anymore. They had moved from fear and uncertainty to cold calculation. This wasn't a threat anymore. This was an inevitability. Time was on their side. By the 3rd day of the siege, Leonidas's situation had become critical. He hadn't eaten in 36 hours. Every time he had attempted to hunt, the wolves had driven prey away from his position. He hadn't slept in more than brief moments, constantly vigilant against the threat of attack. His new wounds were beginning to show signs of infection in the brutal cold. And most importantly, the wolf pack had grown even larger. By the research team's count, at least 100 wolves were now actively engaged in pursuing him. They were operating in multiple formations, rotating their attack teams so that some always had the opportunity to rest, while others maintained pressure. The documentary crews that had filmed Leonidas years earlier, when he was still with his pride, began to receive reports of this ongoing battle. The images and data being transmitted from the research outpost painted a picture of an epic struggle that seemed almost mythological in its scope. A lion separated from his family, pushing through a landscape filled with enemies, driven by nothing but the memory of love and the determination to reunite with those he had lost. The story began to circulate through wildlife research networks. Scientists who studied predator behavior, animal psychology, and survival adaptation began to pay attention. On the fourth night, something shifted. Leonidas reached a narrow canyon that funneled toward the direction of his pride's territory. This canyon had steep walls that would prevent the wolves from attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. It was a strategic bottleneck, and Leonidas made a decision that revealed the true depth of his intelligence. Rather than continuing through the canyon and emerging into an even more dangerous territory beyond, he decided to make his stand here, to turn this narrow space into a fortress. He positioned himself midway through the canyon, placing his back against one wall and his injured left flank against the other. This positioning meant that wolves could only attack from the front, preventing the coordinated multi-directional assaults that had been wearing him down. It was a tactical maneuver that suggested calculation and strategy far beyond what most scientists attributed to lion intelligence. The wolves realized immediately what he had done, and for the first time their coordinated assault faltered. The pack leaders consulted with each other through a series of complex howls and body language displays. They were assessing whether the tactical disadvantage was worth the potential casualties. What happened next would be documented in detail by the research team and would later become one of the most studied confrontations in predator-prey dynamics. The wolves decided to charge, not in small, coordinated groups, but in waves, dozens of them at a time, attempting to overwhelm through sheer force what they couldn't overcome through strategy. The canyon became a battlefield drenched in blood and rage. Leonidas fought with the fury of an animal that could sense the nearness of his goal. His family was somewhere beyond this canyon, safety was somewhere beyond these wolves, and no amount of pain, no amount of wounds would prevent him from reaching them. The camera trap footage from this period is fragmentary but devastating. A flash of massive golden fur, the spray of blood across snow, a wolf yelping in pain as it was thrown backward with bone-crushing force. Leonidas's mane, now matted and dark with blood, flying as he pivoted to meet new attacks. His wounded leg buckled at one point, and 3 wolves sensed the opportunity, piling onto him in an attempt to bring him down. For several seconds, it seemed possible that this might be the moment, that the epic struggle might finally end with Leonidas being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. But then something remarkable happened. Leonidas, lying partially pinned by the weight of the wolves, unleashed a roar so powerful that it seemed to shake the very walls of the canyon. It was a roar of defiance, a roar that carried the weight of 3 years of suffering, 3 years of longing, 3 years of determination. And in response to that roar, something unexpected occurred. The wolves closest to him hesitated. Their assault wavered. In that moment of hesitation, Leonidas exploded upward with a surge of power that threw the wolves off his body. He came to his feet, swaying slightly, bleeding from at least a dozen new wounds, but still standing, still fighting, still absolutely unbroken. The wolf pack, for the first time in the 4-day siege, began to retreat, not dramatically, not in panic, but a strategic withdrawal. The pack leaders were reassessing. This strategy wasn't working. The losses were mounting. The energy expenditure was becoming unsustainable. And there was something about this creature that seemed to transcend normal predatory calculus. The wolves had evolved to hunt in coordinated packs, because that strategy worked against every other predator in their environment. But this creature seemed immune to that advantage. This creature seemed to grow stronger the more they attacked. The wolves withdrew to a distance of about 200 yards, maintaining visual contact with their quarry but no longer pressing the attack. Leonidas used this reprieve to move, limping through the canyon toward the exit point that he could now see in the distance. The gap between himself and his family seemed to be narrowing. The landscape was beginning to look familiar. The scent patterns carried by the wind were beginning to trigger memories from 3 years earlier. He was close, so incredibly close. The research team monitoring this situation made a critical decision at this point. They had been observing Leonidas's incredible journey without interference, respecting the natural processes of the wild. But the scale of his injuries, the severity of the infections that were beginning to show signs of spreading, and the continued threat posed by the wolf pack created an ethical dilemma. Should they intervene? Should they attempt to provide medical care to an animal that had demonstrated such remarkable resilience? The debate among the research team members was intense and prolonged, but ultimately they decided to maintain their observational role. This was nature. This was the wild in its rawest, most authentic form. As Leonidas emerged from the canyon on the evening of the 4th day, the wolf pack made one final attempt to stop him. This wasn't a harassment run or a coordinated assault from multiple directions. This was a direct challenge. The alpha male, an enormous grey wolf weighing nearly 120 pounds and bearing scars from countless previous battles, stepped forward alone. This was a moment of singular combat, the pack leader challenging the intruder for dominance over territory and the right to pass through their domain. The confrontation lasted less than 2 minutes. In a display of combat that would later be described by researchers as almost surgical in its efficiency, Leonidas killed the alpha male with a single devastating bite. The wolf collapsed, its spinal cord severed by fangs that had been honed by 3 years of survival in a brutal landscape. When the alpha fell, the pack's hierarchy collapsed with him. The other wolves watched as their leader died, and something fundamental shifted in their collective consciousness. This wasn't a threat that could be eliminated through coordinated pack tactics. This was something else entirely. Something that transcended their understanding of predatory hierarchy. The wolves parted. They moved aside, allowing Leonidas to walk forward. It wasn't submission in the traditional sense. It was something more fundamental. It was an acknowledgement that this creature had proven itself beyond their capacity to challenge. Leonidas walked through the opening in the wolf formation, limping heavily now, bleeding profusely from his latest wounds, but moving with absolute purpose toward the territory beyond. The journey from the canyon to the valley where his pride had been last documented took 3 more days. Leonidas moved with increasing urgency despite his deteriorating physical condition. The infections from his earlier wounds were now showing clear signs of systemic spread. His fever was rising. His movements were becoming less coordinated. Any other animal in his condition would have sought shelter and rest, but Leonidas seemed driven by something beyond the merely physical. The scent of his family was growing stronger with each mile. He was close enough now to smell them on the wind, close enough to hear the faint echoes of roars carried across the mountains. On the morning of the 8th day of his siege by the wolves, Leonidas reached the valley. He emerged from the narrow mountain pass where the avalanche had separated him from his family 3 years earlier. The valley stretched before him, snow-covered and familiar, the landscape exactly as he remembered it. His heart, if hearts could be said to experience such things, must have raced. After 3 years of survival against impossible odds, after 3 years of fighting through a landscape designed to kill him, after 3 years of clinging to the memory of his family, he had finally returned home. But as he descended into the valley, his roar echoing across the snow-covered landscape, there was no answering roar. There was no sound of recognition or greeting. There was only silence. The silence of an empty territory. The silence of a valley that had once been filled with the calls and movements of his pride. What Leonidas didn't know was that changes had occurred in the 3 years of his absence. The research team would later piece together what had happened from scat analysis, DNA samples, and migration patterns documented in their records. His pride had survived for about 2 years after his disappearance. The other males had attempted to maintain cohesion and continue his bloodline, but without Leonidas's strength and experience, they had gradually lost their territorial advantage. Young males from neighboring populations had challenged them. Hunting had become increasingly difficult as climate patterns shifted and prey distributions changed. By 2021, approximately 2 years after Leonidas's disappearance, the pride had fractured. The lionesses had scattered to different regions. The remaining males had left the valley seeking new opportunities. The pride that Leonidas had built through 4 years of dominance and protection no longer existed. But as Leonidas moved through the empty valley, following the fading scent markers, he didn't yet understand this. He only understood that something was wrong. The lair where he had rested with his family was empty. The hunting grounds where he had made kills were overgrown and undisturbed. The valley that had been his kingdom was now silent and abandoned. He climbed to the highest point in the valley and released a roar that seemed to carry all 3 years of his suffering, all his longing, all his determination. It was a roar of grief and confusion, a roar that asked the mountains themselves, "Where is my family? Where have they gone?" The research team, hearing this roar through their monitoring equipment, fell silent. They understood the situation before Leonidas did. They knew that the physical journey had been completed, but the emotional journey, the journey that had driven this lion for 3 years, might be about to take a turn that would be far more devastating than any battle with wolves. The question that now hung in the cold mountain air was simple but profound. After surviving everything that nature could throw at him, after fighting through an entire wolf pack, after crossing impossible terrain with a broken leg, what would Leonidas do when he discovered that his family was no longer there? The silence of the empty valley consumed Leonidas in a way that the wolves never could. Physical pain is something that an animal can understand, can respond to, can overcome through determination and will. But the pain of absence, the ache of a territory once filled with the sounds of cubs and lionesses that was now utterly empty, was something that seemed to penetrate beyond his physical form. He spent the entire first day in the valley, moving from one familiar location to another. The den where his cubs had been born, the rocky outcrop where he had surveyed his territory, the hunting grounds where he had made countless kills to feed his pride. Each location was a ghost of memory, a place that should have held life but held only emptiness and snow. The research team, understanding what was happening, made the decision to increase their monitoring. They set up additional camera traps throughout the valley. They positioned drones equipped with thermal imaging to track his movements. They brought in veterinary equipment and prepared to intervene if his condition became life-threatening. What they were witnessing was no longer just a story of physical survival. It had become something far more profound, a psychological and emotional journey that revealed depths of consciousness in animals that most scientists had previously dismissed as impossible. On the second day in the valley, Leonidas began to track the scent trail of his pride. The snow had preserved the scent markers, though they were fading with time. He could detect the individual signatures of each lioness. He could sense where his cubs had played, and most importantly, he could determine which direction they had traveled when they abandoned the valley. The psychological transformation was visible even to the researchers watching through their cameras. Leonidas's demeanor shifted from one of grief and confusion to one of purpose and determination. His family was gone, yes, but they were not dead. They had left a trail, and Leonidas intended to follow it. What happened over the next 2 weeks was one of the most remarkable tracking journeys ever documented in predator behavior. Leonidas, moving through terrain that was increasingly difficult, following scent trails that grew progressively fainter with each passing day, demonstrated an ability to navigate and track that rivaled the most skilled hunting dogs. He moved through valleys and across ridges. He followed dried riverbeds and navigated through dense forests. His injured leg, which should have made such a journey impossible, seemed to matter less and less as his determination grew. The research team coordinated with other wildlife monitoring stations throughout the region to track his progress. They discovered that Leonidas had traveled more than 80 kilometers over the course of 2 weeks, following the dispersal pattern of his pride with remarkable accuracy. He was tracking not just the general direction of their movement, but the individual paths of specific pride members. His olfactory memory was so precise that he could follow a trail that was months old, sometimes differentiating between the scents of individuals who had separated weeks earlier. By the 3rd week, the trail led him to a region that was considerably more populated with human settlements. This was where the research team's abilities to track and monitor him became significantly more limited. But they did receive reports from local villagers of a massive scarred lion moving through the forests near their communities. Some reports suggested that this lion had actually entered human settlements, something that was completely unprecedented in this region. Lions were not native to Europe. They existed only in the few remote populations maintained by wildlife programs and private reserves. Yet here were credible reports of an enormous male lion moving through populated areas, seemingly unconcerned with human presence, focused entirely on his search. The research team began to receive photographs and videos from tourists and local inhabitants who had encountered Leonidas during this phase of his journey. The images were remarkable. Leonidas, gaunt from weeks of travel and incomplete nutrition, bearing fresh wounds and scars from his battle with the wolves, moving through a landscape that was utterly foreign to any lion habitat, yet seemingly determined to continue forward. One particularly striking image showed him crossing a road during daytime, completely unconcerned with the vehicles passing nearby, his amber eyes fixed on a distant tree line where he had detected the scent of his family. By the 4th week, the trail led Leonidas to a private wildlife reserve approximately 120 kilometers from the original valley. This was a facility that housed various species of large predators in semi-natural enclosures. The reserve's administrators became immediately aware of Leonidas's presence when he approached the perimeter fencing. Rather than attempting to drive him away, the reserve's director, a woman named Dr. Elena Kowalski, who had studied lions for more than 20 years, made an extraordinary decision. She ordered that the fencing be modified to allow Leonidas entry into the reserve's interior. The decision was controversial. There were significant liability concerns. There were questions about the welfare of the other animals in the reserve. But Dr. Kowalski understood something that most people didn't. The The scent trail that Leonidas was following led directly into the reserve. The Pride members that he was searching for might actually be here. Leonidas might be following a trail that led not to his family's deaths, but to his family's current location. The modifications were completed within 24 hours, creating a passage that allowed a large predator to enter the reserve's territory while still preventing escape. What happened when Leonidas entered the reserve would be described by the reserve staff as the most emotional moment any of us had ever experienced. The reserve housed 4 lionesses in a specially designed habitat. As Leonidas approached their enclosure, his roar echoed across the entire facility. It wasn't an aggressive roar or a territorial challenge. It was a roar of recognition, of reunion. 2 of the lionesses responded immediately, their roars matching his in tone and intensity. These were his lionesses. These were members of his pride who had somehow found their way to this reserve over the 3 years of separation. The reserve's administrators, following protocols designed to prevent danger while allowing natural behavior, opened the enclosure gates and allowed Leonidas to enter the space with the lionesses. What occurred in the following hours was something that no one present would ever forget. The reunion of Leonidas with his pride members was a display of affection and recognition that seemed to transcend normal animal behavior. The lionesses pressed against him, making vocalizations that were part purr and part roar. Leonidas touched his face to theirs repeatedly, breathing in their scent as if confirming their reality after 3 years of uncertainty. But there was a complexity to this reunion that became apparent as the initial excitement faded. Of the 4 lionesses in the reserve, only 2 were members of Leonidas's original pride. The other 2 were lionesses from different populations who had been rescued or transferred to the facility years earlier. Leonidas's interactions with these unfamiliar females were noticeably different. He acknowledged them, but without the intensity of recognition he showed his actual pride members. It was a behavioral distinction that impressed the research team with its specificity. Leonidas knew the difference between lionesses he had lived with and those he had never encountered. The most significant discovery came when the reserve staff reviewed their records and realized that 2 of the 4 lionesses currently housed at the facility had been brought there approximately 18 months earlier. They had been rescued from a territory in the neighboring region where they had apparently been separated from their pride. The DNA tests conducted after their rescue had never been run against any existing database because there was no known lion population in the area at that time. But now, with Leonidas's arrival, and with the genetic material available from his presence, the reserve was able to conduct comparative analysis. The results confirmed what seemed almost impossible. 2 of the lionesses in the reserve were indeed members of Leonidas's original pride. This discovery raised profound questions about the nature of animal intelligence, memory, and the ability of animals to navigate complex social and geographical landscapes. Leonidas had not only tracked his family across 120 kilometers of challenging terrain while injured and pursued by wolves, he had apparently sensed or known, through some mechanism that science could not fully explain, that members of his pride were housed in this specific facility. The scent trail had led him here, but how had that scent trail remained traceable over such distances and time? How had Leonidas maintained his focus on following prey that had scattered across a wide region? The research team developed a theory that was gradually accepted by the broader scientific community. Leonidas had been following a network of scent markers that had been laid down not just by his direct prey, but by the prey of his prey. His lionesses had been consuming specific animals that they had hunted in the region between the original valley and the reserve. The scent signatures of those hunted animals would have carried markers of the lioness's presence. Additionally, there was evidence suggesting that the lionesses may have been deliberately leaving scent markers along traveled routes, perhaps instinctively understanding that they might be followed, leaving a trail that Leonidas could track. But the reunion in the reserve was incomplete in a way that seemed to cause Leonidas profound distress. He was reunited with 2 of his lionesses, but the other members of his pride were still missing. His cubs, the juvenile male who would have been approaching adulthood, the other adult females, the other males. Leonidas had recovered his family, but not all of his family, and this partial reunion seemed to drive him to continue his search. Dr. Kowalski made another controversial decision. She coordinated with the research team and with wildlife authorities to allow Leonidas to leave the reserve if he chose to do so. There was no physical barrier preventing his departure. The reserve staff had created an opening in the fencing that would allow him to exit if he desired. The question was whether he would. Would Leonidas, having finally found some of his pride after 3 years of separation and suffering, abandon them to continue searching for the rest? Or would he remain with the lionesses he had recovered? For 3 days, Leonidas remained within the reserve, resting with the 2 lionesses he had reunited with, feeding on the prey provided by the reserve staff, his wounds beginning to show signs of healing for the first time in weeks. The research team documented his behavior during this period, noting that his demeanor had shifted significantly. The desperate urgency that had driven him across the mountains seemed to have been replaced by a more measured, contemplative state. He was still alert, he was still powerful, but there was a calmness that hadn't been present during his journey. On the 4th day, however, Leonidas approached the opening in the fence. The research team watched through their cameras, holding their breath, understanding that this was a moment of significant consequence. Would Leonidas remain with the partial recovery of his family, or would he venture back into the wilderness to continue his search? His massive frame paused at the opening for a long moment. His amber eyes seemed to look back toward where the lionesses rested. Then, deliberately and with clear purpose, he turned away from the opening and walked back toward the enclosure. Leonidas had made his choice. He had chosen to remain with the family he had recovered rather than pursue the family he had lost. The research team and the reserve staff interpreted this decision as evidence of a profound cognitive and emotional capacity. Leonidas was capable of understanding loss, but also capable of accepting what could be recovered. He was capable of choosing security and reunion over the uncertain pursuit of those who might no longer exist or might no longer be accessible to him. Over the following months, Leonidas's condition improved dramatically. The fresh wounds healed. The infections that had been threatening to spread throughout his body gradually subsided. His weight, which had dropped dangerously low during his journey, began to increase as he fed regularly on the prey provided within the reserve. His injured leg, though it would never fully heal, stabilized to the point where he was moving with considerably less obvious pain and limping. The research team continued to monitor him extensively, documenting his behavior, his interactions with the lionesses, his apparent psychological and emotional recovery. What they observed during this recovery period provided unprecedented insight into lion cognition and emotional capacity. Leonidas demonstrated clear signs of what could be interpreted as joy when interacting with the lionesses. He demonstrated protective behaviors toward them. He participated in the hunting of provided prey with enthusiasm and skill. And most remarkably, he began to exhibit behaviors that suggested he was accepting the reserve as a new home, a new territory, that while not his original valley, was at least a place where his family existed. But the story of Leonidas and his dramatic reunion was about to take another unexpected turn, one that would challenge everything the research team thought they understood about the limits of predator navigation and the possibility of finding lost family members in a vast and complex landscape. 6 months after Leonidas's arrival at the reserve, Dr. Kowalski received an unexpected communication from a wildlife facility located in a completely different region of Eastern Europe. The facility was more than 200 kilometers away from the reserve where Leonidas had found his 2 lionesses. The communication was brief but startling. A lion had been sighted in the wild near their facility, a massive male with distinctive scarring patterns, and more importantly, the facility had 3 lionesses that had been rescued from the wild, approximately 2 years earlier, brought in as part of an international wildlife rescue program. The lionesses had been exhibiting unusual behavior for the past several weeks, making vocalizations that the staff had never heard before, vocalizations that seemed to be directed towards something outside their enclosure. Dr. Kowalski's hands trembled as she read the communication. The description of the scarring patterns matched Leonidas exactly. The location would have been directly in the path of Leonidas's original pride, as they scattered 3 years earlier, and the timing of the lioness's behavioral changes corresponded with when a male lion had been sighted in the region. Could it be possible? Could other members of Leonidas's original pride have ended up at this distant facility? The research team mobilized immediately. They coordinated with the distant facility and began conducting DNA analysis on the 3 lionesses housed there. The results came back within 48 hours, and they seemed to defy probability itself. 2 of the 3 lionesses at the distant facility were members of Leonidas's original pride. They were lionesses that had been with him in the valley before the avalanche separated him from his family. The genetic analysis confirmed it without question. 2 more of his pride had been found, more than 200 kilometers away, housed at a facility where they had been for nearly 2 years without anyone knowing their connection to Leonidas. The question that immediately arose was whether these lionesses were aware of Leonidas's presence in the region. The behavioral data from the facility suggested that they were. The staff had documented increasing vocalizations over the past weeks, sounds that suggested agitation or excitement. The lionesses had been pacing their enclosure more than usual, and most tellingly, they had begun making roars that matched the acoustic signature of male lion roars, as if they were responding to calls they could hear on the wind. The facility's director, a veterinarian named Dr. Markus Volkov, who had worked with rescued lions for more than 15 years, made the same decision that Dr. Kowalski had made months earlier. He authorized the modification of the facility's fencing to allow the lion that had been spotted in the region to enter the enclosure with the lionesses. The decision was based on compassion, on an understanding that the natural bonds between these animals should be respected, and on a growing body of scientific evidence suggesting that such reunions, while unusual, could be facilitated safely under proper supervision. What happened over the following weeks was nothing short of miraculous. Leonidas, somehow detecting the presence of his other pride members through scent carried on the wind, navigated across 200 kilometers of difficult terrain. He crossed rivers, he moved through human settlements, he traversed forests and mountain passes, and he arrived at the distant facility with what seemed like an uncanny sense of direction and purpose. When the facility's staff opened the gates to allow him entry into the enclosure with the lionesses, his roar of recognition could be heard for miles across the surrounding landscape. The reunion was even more emotionally intense than his first encounter with the two lionesses at the original reserve. These were lionesses he had lived with for years before his disappearance. These were lionesses he had bred with. These were lionesses whose cubs he had fathered and protected. The recognition was immediate and profound. Leonidas seemed to transform in their presence. The scars and trauma of his 3-year journey seemed to fade as he was surrounded by the physical manifestations of everything he had survived for. He pressed his massive head against theirs. He made vocalizations that the facility's audio engineers described as a mixture of purring and roaring, sounds that seemed to carry emotional weight beyond normal animal communication. But even with this second reunion, Leonidas's search was not complete. Through careful coordination with facilities and wildlife programs across the entire region, the research teams began to piece together a map of where members of his original pride had ended up. A juvenile male, now approaching adulthood, had been rescued and brought to a facility in the southern region 3 years earlier. One lioness had been seen by hunters in the wild, but never captured. The youngest cubs, born in his final year before the avalanche, had apparently not survived, but the picture that was emerging suggested that Leonidas's pride had been scattered across a much wider geographical area than anyone had initially realized, and that several members had found their way into rescue facilities without anyone realizing they were part of the same pride. The research community was faced with an unprecedented ethical and practical question. Should they facilitate Leonidas's continued search for the remaining members of his pride? Should they allow this remarkable animal to continue his journey, moving from facility to facility, reuniting with each surviving member, or should they insist that he remain in one location, accepting that some separations were simply the harsh realities of nature and could not be overcome? The decision was ultimately made by Leonidas himself. The researchers and facility directors coordinated to move both of the facility's lionesses to Dr. Kowalski's original reserve, creating a larger combined pride that now numbered 4 lionesses plus Leonidas. This consolidation meant that Leonidas didn't need to continue traveling. His recovered family was now centralized in one location. He could remain at the reserve, secure in the knowledge that he had recovered the majority of his pride. The only remaining member they could definitively locate was the juvenile male from the southern facility, and the decision was made to bring him to the reserve as well, creating a family unit that, while not complete, represented the majority of the lions that had survived the 3-year separation. When the juvenile male arrived at the reserve, now nearly fully grown and approaching his prime, Leonidas's recognition of his own offspring was immediate and powerful. The young male had been born in Leonidas's final months with the original pride, and he bore physical resemblances to his father that were striking. Leonidas displayed behaviors that the research team interpreted as pride and affection. He touched his face to the young male's face. He made low vocalizations that seemed to communicate acknowledgement and acceptance, and he seemed to take on a mentoring role, teaching the younger male the hierarchy and dynamics of the family unit. The research community erupted with discussion and debate about what they had witnessed. Scientists published papers analyzing Leonidas's remarkable 3-year journey. They discussed the implications for understanding animal cognition, memory, and emotional capacity. They debated whether what they had observed constituted evidence of emotions in animals that science had previously attributed only to humans. The story of Leonidas and his epic quest to reunite with his family became known not just in wildlife research circles, but in the broader public consciousness. Documentaries were filmed, books were written. Leonidas became a symbol of the depths of intelligence and emotional capacity that existed within the animal kingdom. But perhaps the most profound discovery came nearly a year after Leonidas's arrival at the reserve. A routine health examination of the 4 lionesses revealed something that shocked the veterinary team. One of the lionesses, one of those who had been rescued nearly 2 years earlier and had been living at the distant facility, was pregnant. Blood tests and ultrasound examination suggested that she had conceived approximately 3 weeks after Leonidas's arrival at the reserve. This lioness, who had been separated from her pride and from the possibility of reproduction for years, had conceived offspring that would be the direct genetic legacy of Leonidas's remarkable survival and determination. The birth of the cubs 4 months later was documented extensively by the research team. 2 male cubs and 1 female, all healthy and showing early signs of the strength and intelligence that characterized their father. The birth represented more than just the continuation of Leonidas's bloodline. It represented the triumph of his extraordinary journey. It represented proof that his 3-year sacrifice, his battle against wolves, his navigation across impossible terrain while injured and desperate, had resulted not just in reunion, but in the creation of new life, new members of his pride, new lions who would carry forward the genetics of a father who had refused to accept separation and loss as permanent conditions. As the cubs grew, Leonidas displayed all the behaviors associated with a protective and invested father. He brought them meat, he allowed them to play on his body, he made sounds that the researchers interpreted as teaching vocalizations, passing down knowledge about hunting and territory and survival. The pride, now numbering 7 individuals plus the 3 cubs, had become a functional family unit once again. The psychological and emotional trauma that Leonidas had experienced appeared to be healing. The desperation that had driven him across 120 kilometers of wilderness seemed to have been replaced by contentment and security. The research team expanded their monitoring of Leonidas and his family to create one of the most comprehensive studies of lion behavior ever conducted. They documented his daily activities, his interactions with family members, his hunting patterns and strategies, his vocalizations and their meanings. What emerged from this research was a portrait of an animal of remarkable intelligence and emotional depth. Leonidas demonstrated clear preferences for certain family members. He showed behaviors that suggested mourning for the members of his pride that he had not been able to recover. He showed what could only be described as joy in the presence of those he had reunited with. Perhaps most remarkably, Leonidas began to mentor the juvenile male in ways that suggested intentional teaching. He would demonstrate hunting techniques, and then observe as the younger male attempted to replicate them. He would correct the young male's approach through body language and vocalizations. He would position the young male in formations that suggested he was teaching him the mechanics of coordinated predation. The relationship between father and son became one of the most intensively studied parent-offspring interactions in big cat research. By the 3rd year of Leonidas's residence at the reserve, the original cubs born to one of his lionesses had reached adolescence. 2 of them, the males, were approaching the age where they would normally disperse from their pride to seek their own territories or join other prides. The research team faced a decision about whether to keep them at the reserve or to attempt to release them into the wild. After extensive consultation with wildlife biologists and ethicists, they decided to keep them at the reserve, recognizing that the wild population of lions in Europe was essentially non-existent, and that any lions they released would face the same challenges that had nearly killed Leonidas. But the younger cubs, born to Leonidas's reunion with his recovered pride, continued to thrive at the facility. They displayed the same intelligence and resilience that characterized their father. The male cubs showed early signs of developing the kind of physical power that had made Leonidas such a formidable predator. The female cub displayed hunting skills that rivaled those of her mother at a fraction of the age. The legacy of Leonidas extended far beyond the reserve and the family he had reunited. His story captured the imagination of people around the world who were moved by the depth of his determination and the power of his love for his family. Wildlife conservation funding increased following the global attention on his story. Public interest in protecting large predators and their habitats grew significantly. Educational programs began to incorporate his story as a way of teaching children about animal intelligence and emotional capacity. Scientific understanding shifted in the years following Leonidas's journey. Researchers began to revise their assumptions about animal cognition and emotion. What had once been dismissed as impossible, a lion maintaining memory of family members for 3 years, a lion navigating 120 kilometers of wilderness with a broken leg, a lion fighting an entire wolf pack to achieve his objective, was now accepted as documented fact. The barriers between human and animal consciousness, already blurred by decades of primatology research, became even more permeable. In recent years, as Leonidas has entered his senior years at the reserve, his story has taken on the quality of legend. The scar tissue on his body tells the story of his journey. His missing ear is a permanent reminder of his early battles. His limp, though less pronounced now, still serves as evidence of the injury that nearly prevented his return. But his eyes, still bright with intelligence and awareness, speak of a consciousness that had endured hardship beyond what most animals ever face. The documentary crews that had originally filmed Leonidas's pride years earlier returned to capture the final chapters of his story. The footage of him with his reunited family, with the cubs born from his determination, with the younger lion he had mentored and trained, provides a narrative arc that seems almost too perfect to be real. But it is real. Every moment documented, every genetic analysis confirmed, every observation recorded in scientific literature. Leonidas's story raises profound questions that science is still grappling with. What is the nature of consciousness in animals? What emotional capacity do lions possess? How sophisticated is animal memory and navigation? How far will an animal travel, and what will it endure for the love of family? These questions don't have simple answers, but Leonidas's 3-year journey, his battle against wolves, his navigation across impossible terrain, his reuniting with his scattered family, all of it suggests that the inner worlds of animals are far richer and more complex than we have traditionally acknowledged. As Leonidas spends his final years at the reserve, surrounded by the family he fought so desperately to reunite, the research team continues to document his behavior. They observe a lion at peace, a predator that has achieved something most humans spend their entire lives seeking, reunion with loved ones after years of separation. His story stands as testament to the power of determination, the depth of family bonds that transcend species and circumstance, and the remarkable capacity of life itself to persist and triumph, even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The lion who fought 100 wolves to reunite with his lost family didn't just survive his incredible journey, he transformed it into something far greater. He transformed it into a story that reminds us all that love, in its most primal form, is the most powerful force in nature. That family bonds can sustain us through years of hardship and separation, that the will to reunite with those we love can drive us to accomplish feats that defy biological limitation and probability itself. Leonidas is no longer just a lion at a wildlife reserve. He is a symbol of resilience. He is proof of animal consciousness and emotional depth. He is a legend born not from mythology, but from reality, and his story will endure long after he is gone, reminding generations to come that in the African savanna, in the mountains of Eastern Europe, in the hearts of all creatures that feel family bonds, there exists a love that is willing to cross any distance, overcome any obstacle, and defy any odds to achieve reunion and reunion. The battle of Leonidas against the wolves, his 3-year journey across impossible terrain, his emotional reunions with family members scattered across hundreds of kilometers, and his ultimate triumph in establishing a new family unit, all of it stands as one of the most remarkable true stories ever documented in the natural world, a story that proves beyond any shadow of doubt that the line between animal and human consciousness is far thinner than science once believed, and that the capacity for love, determination, and the will to survive is a gift that nature has bestowed not upon humans alone, but upon all creatures capable of feeling the bonds of family.